Thank you very much for your kind invitation to this beautiful venue. When I was invited, I was asked to talk about EU-Iran relations. During the coffee break, I was asked to answer to all criticism voiced towards the EU, so I hope you have a few days for me to come back to that. In any case, I fully agree that we live in very critical times and that we should be very much aware of what it is we want to see to leave behind. Sitting in a centuries-old building, I always think that that's an important reminder, and I can only hope that we can be enlightened by the beauty around us and seeking solutions here together. For those of you who don't know me, I represent the Progressive Liberal Party from the Netherlands. I'm from Amsterdam, but I run on a national platform. And since 2009, I've been serving in the European Parliament, focusing on foreign affairs, international trade, but also in particular the role that new technologies play and the role of press freedom. Given the role of the Journalism Association, I want to share that too. And I immediately became a spokesperson on Iran in the liberal family of the European Parliament. It all started, of course, with an overlap of the European parliamentary elections in 2009 and the Green Movement and the protests against the presidential elections in Iran. And I believe that the Green Movement and those demonstrations and the courage of so many individuals inspired masses of people throughout the Middle East. And even though the outcomes of the uprisings are presenting us with enormous challenges, we should not forget the very legitimate demands that brought so many people to the streets. These uprisings swept through North Africa and the Middle East. We now see them moving to Asia, and of course we've seen changes in the Ukraine. And especially when we look at the Middle East and Ukraine, Russia is a very toxic common denominator which has moved away from common interests with the EU gradually and very firmly. And my focus over these past 5 years has been to try to make sure that Europe is stronger and more effective on the global stage. And we can only do so if we're willing to lead by example. And sadly, we also still continue to have challenges to media pluralism, as we've seen in this country, but also the rule of law, as we see in a country like Hungary, where Viktor Orban seems to look towards Russia for inspiration when he makes the case for an illiberal democracy in the European Union of today. And I think that the challenges between open and closed societies, as Mr. Ahi hinted to, is also coming to our own doorsteps and is one that we have to fight vigilantly if we want to be a credible actor in the world. And I believe that the EU has been too absent, either in dealing with challenges such as the rule of law in Hungary, but especially when it comes to the Middle East, the war in Syria, and basically all of the problems we find in our immediate neighborhood. And I'm making the case throughout my work for more European leadership based on values, because I think the EU is not as effective and as present as it should be. Now, on EU-Iran relations, first let me say a few brief words about the role that Iran is playing in the Middle East, in Syria, where reluctantly we hear more acknowledgement of mistakes having been made, of not acknowledging the legitimate concerns that brought some peaceful demonstrators to the streets in the initial days. The role in Lebanon, Iraq, Yemen, and Bahrain, where I think the narrative of government officials is now that Iran is and can only be a part of the solution in the fight against IS or Daesh. But of course, many in Europe and the rest of the world see Iran at least also as part of the problem. And the narrative of ending extremism in the Middle East is not credible or effective if we cannot talk about the role of Hezbollah and the role of Hamas in the Middle East, and of course the links with Iran. And each and every time during the visits that I took to Iran or in other conversations with officials of the regime or of other political streams of power in Iran, there has not been an answer to this question. It is a topic that simply is ignored. And I think that what is troubling is that people who are considered moderates in the political spectrum in Iran are also speaking along a different logic from what most European politicians believe is an assessment of the situation and it should only give us an idea of what more hardline ideologists believe. But a focus on the Middle East and on problems in the neighborhood, which of course we share in terms of being concerned, it serves a different purpose as well. It takes attention away from addressing problems in Iran itself, where of course the list is very long. I don't have to convince you, but I think it is important to note that I personally observed between the visit that I paid to Iran in December and the one that I paid last June, that hope of the people is quickly fading, and they are waiting for the promises made in the election campaigns to be delivered in terms of results. And I don't think they care as much about whether we can work together in fighting Daesh or about the nuclear deal necessarily. There are much more immediate issues like their future, the perspective of having jobs, liberties, equal rights between men and women that are keeping people up at night. The other goal of the government in Iran in addressing these Middle East problems so prominently, I believe, is an attempt to create a parallel track of cooperation and building trust with the international community alongside the nuclear talks, which are increasingly difficult. And I believe that this kind of attempt at bargaining or opening up a parallel track is risky, and it is not working necessarily. It has been mentioned that perhaps there are tactical overlaps in fighting Daesh, but it doesn't mean that the broader strategic interests are the same or that there's enough trust there to work together beyond the pragmatic level, which we know is happening. And clearly, for the EU, but I see this in the broader international community, the nuclear talks remain the main hurdle to be taken. If that hurdle is not taken, a lot of other issues cannot appropriately be addressed. And although the focus in these talks is now on the United States and Iran, and perhaps the two of them can even see the contours of a deal that is feasible, there's a lack of courage and leadership on both sides to gather political support. And I think that that is the point where we stand now, and I believe that both in the United States and Iran, although very different, the hardliners are smelling blood. So what can the EU do more than just chairing the P5+1 negotiations? I believe, and I'll repeat it here, that we need an independent strategy, a new agenda for relations with Iran. And it is not acceptable to be considered as part of the West all the time. Iranian government speaks of the West consistently, but the EU is clearly something very different than the United States. We have different interests, and we must underline it proactively, otherwise this narrative persists. And we did support the very severe last round of sanctions that the United States also adopted, but we have a very distinct history in terms of cultural ties and people-to-people context that I think we should acknowledge, and I'm sure that we will have a different future if we choose to craft it. I'm worried that a nuclear deal, at least in a comprehensive form, is less and less likely. And when it fails, I think that the EU should immediately take the role of seeking to temper the retaliation that I anticipate from both the US Congress and the Iranian Majlis. And I believe that it is only the EU which can try to mitigate these tensions. But much more broadly, we should not stare only at the nuclear negotiations. There are plenty of other issues on our agenda. For the EU, human rights has and will be top of the agenda. And this is not an easy discussion with officials in Iran, but some openings can be observed. We have had talks about the death penalty, and I know that there are lively discussions also about religious experts in Iran of whether or not people can make mistakes, and therefore the death penalty being perhaps not as favorable as it has been in the past. And I think the EU should pick up this discussion and look at how we can move that forward, because of course we call for a moratorium on the death penalty at least. But also in the context of fighting drug trafficking. Islamic Republic officials are keen to get international help, for example, through scanners of containers, but also through police cooperation and otherwise to curb the drug smuggling from Afghanistan. Now, one of the problems beyond sanctions on dual-use items is also that the EU will not cooperate in capturing criminals that may face the death penalty down the road. But if we can find a space within which which cooperation is possible, it may actually also decrease the death penalty numbers, for which of course many are officially executed on the basis of drug-related crimes. Similarly, the human rights around refugees from Afghanistan can be addressed through cooperation, which I think is an opportunity. But what is very, very clear is that it is a sensitive topic for the officials. And I think that the European Parliament has been in the lead and that we are in the best position to do so, because the High Representative, as chairing the nuclear talks, is not always necessarily interested in addressing different difficult issues, because it undermines or burdens the negotiations by, for example, strained relations to talk about topics like human rights that Iranian officials don't want to talk about. The member states of the European Union have very different history with Iran, sometimes very difficult. Think about the United Kingdom, for example, or have different interests. And if we don't stand firmly together, representing the people of the European Union, then we are easily played apart. I believe that divided Europe is a weak Europe, and so the European Parliament is in a good position to make this overall perspective instead of the member state by member state perspective. We have in the past successfully pushed for human rights sanctions. Individuals from the Islamic Republic will be placed on lists that prevent them from traveling to the EU or from having funds in the EU. I've personally nominated Nasrin Sotoudeh for the Sakharov Prize, the most important human rights award that the European Parliament awards, and we managed to visit with her later in the Islamic Republic as well. We've adopted numerous resolutions, parliamentary texts that deal with the human rights situation in general, but also highlight the cases of a number of individuals, which we hope has helped them save their lives. So broadly speaking, I believe the European Parliament is in the best position to develop a more people-to-people based agenda. The relationships between Iran and the rest of the world have been difficult, and also mostly in the hands of governments, which has not always helped to look at broader opportunities and to also make a clear distinction between those who are in power and those who have never chosen for those people to be in power, namely the population at large. And I think there are plenty of more opportunities to develop. The development of civil society, pushing for more respect for minority rights, the development of an actual private sector, focusing on practical and political ways to increase digital freedoms and media freedoms in Iran, fostering exchanges between students and other professionals. And we can best do so when the European Union opens its own diplomatic representation or delegation in Tehran, which would also allow it to work more effectively with the several UN agencies that are working in Iran, sometimes quietly, on very difficult issues like the fight against HIV/AIDS. So these are just a few examples of what I think is happening and should be happening in the relationship between the EU and Iran, and in particular the role of the European Parliament. But I believe we need a long-term strategy which indeed should be values-based and not just interest-driven. And it should not be left up to the governments, because we know how difficult that is, but we should really seek to open avenues to address the people in Iran and also make sure that our population can play a role in that. So.